Part 2, Chapter 7 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Zablicki. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 7. The next day was a dreary one for Emma. Everything seemed to her enveloped in a black atmosphere, floating confusedly over the exterior of things, and sorrow was engulfed within her soul, with soft shrieks such as the winter wind makes in ruined castles. It was that reverie which we give to things that will not return, the lassitude that seizes you after everything was done, that pain, in fine, that the interruption of every wonted movement, the sudden cessation of any prolonged vibration, brings on. As on the return from Vaubyessard, when the quadrilles were running in her head, she was full of a gloomy melancholy, of a numb despair. Léon reappeared, taller, handsomer, more charming, more vague. Though separated from her, he had not left her. He was there, and the walls of the house seemed to hold his shadow. She could not detach her eyes from the carpet where he had walked, from those empty chairs where he had sat. The river still flowed on, and slowly drove its ripples along the slippery banks. They had often walked there, to the murmur of the waves over the moss-covered pebbles. How bright the sun had been! What happy afternoons they had seen alone in the shade at the end of the garden! He read aloud, bareheaded, sitting on a footstool of dry sticks. The fresh wind of the meadow set trembling the leaves of the book, and the nasturtiums of the arbour. Ah, he was gone, the only charm of her life, the only possible hope of joy. Why had she not seized this happiness when it came to her? Why not have kept hold of it with both hands, with both knees, when it was about to flee from her? And she cursed herself for not having loved Léon. She thirsted for his lips. The wish took possession of her to run after and rejoin him, throw herself into his arms and say to him, "It is I am yours." But Emma recoiled beforehand at the difficulties of the enterprise, and her desires, increased by regret, became only the more acute. Henceforth, the memory of Léon was the centre of her boredom. It burnt there more brightly than the fire travellers have left on the snow of a Russian steppe. She sprang towards him, she pressed against him, she stirred carefully the dying embers, sought all around her anything that could revive it. And the most distant reminiscences, like the most immediate occasions, what she experienced as well as what she imagined, her voluptuous desires that were unsatisfied, her projects of happiness that crackled in the wind like dead boughs, her sterile virtue, her lost hopes, the domestic tête-à-tête, she gathered it all up, took everything, and made it all serve as fuel for her melancholy. The flames, however, subsided, either because the supply had exhausted itself, or because it had been piled up too much. Love, little by little, was quelled by absence, regret stifled beneath habit, and this incendiary light that had empurpled her pale sky was overspread and faded by degrees. In the supineness of her conscience, she even took her repugnance toward her husband for aspirations towards her lover, the burning of hate for the warmth of tenderness. But as the tempest still raged, and as passion burnt itself down to the very cinders, and no help came, no sun rose, there was night on all sides, and she was lost in that terrible cold that pierced her. Then the evil days of Tostes began again. She thought herself now far more unhappy, for she had the experience of grief, with the certainty that it would not end. A woman who had laid on herself such sacrifices could well allow herself certain whims. She bought a Gothic prie-dieu, and in a month spent 14 francs on lemons for polishing her nails. She wrote to Rouen for a blue cashmere gown. She chose one of Leroux's finest scarves, and wore it knotted around her waist over her dressing-gown. And with closed blinds and a book in her hand, she lay stretched out on a couch in this garb. She often changed her coiffure. She did her hair à la chinoise, in flowing curls, in plaited coils. She parted it on one side and rolled it under like a man's. She wanted to learn Italian. She bought dictionaries, a grammar, and a supply of white paper. She tried serious reading, history, and philosophy. Sometimes in the night, Charles woke up with a start, thinking he was being called to a patient. "I'm coming," he stammered, and it was the noise of a match Emma had struck to relight the lamp. But her reading fared like her piece of embroidery, all of which, only just begun, filled her cupboard. She took it up, left it, passed on to other books. She had attacks in which she could easily have been driven to commit any folly. She maintained one day, in opposition to her husband, that she could drink off a large glass of brandy, and as Charles was stupid enough to dare her, she swallowed the brandy to the last drop. In spite of her vaporous airs, as the housewives of Yonville called them, Emma, all the same, never seemed gay, and usually she had at the corners of her mouth that immobile contraction that puckers the faces of old maids and those of men whose ambitions have failed. She was pale all over, white as a sheet. The skin of her nose was drawn at the nostrils. Her eyes looked at you vaguely. After discovering 3 gray hairs on her temples, she talked much of her old age. She often fainted. One day she even spat blood, and as Charles fussed around her, showing his anxiety, "Bah!" she answered, "what does it matter?" Charles fled to his study and wept there, both his elbows on the table, sitting in an armchair at his bureau, under the phrenological head. Then he wrote to his mother, begging her to come, and they had many long consultations together on the subject of Emma. What should they decide? What was to be done, since she rejected all medical treatment? "Do you know what your wife wants?" replied Madame Bovary senior. "She wants to be forced to occupy herself with some manual work. If she were obliged, like so many others, to earn her living, she wouldn't have these vapours that come to her from a lot of ideas she stuffs into her head, and from the idleness in which she lives. Yet she is always busy," said Charles. "Ah, always busy at what?" "Reading novels, bad books, works against religion, and in which they mock at priests, and speeches taken from Voltaire. But all that leads you far astray, my poor child. Anyone who has no religion always ends by turning out badly." So it was decided to stop Emma reading novels. The enterprise did not seem easy. The good lady undertook it. She was, when she passed through Rouen, to go herself to the lending library, and represent that Emma had discontinued her subscription. Would they not have a right to apply to the police if the librarian persisted all the same in his poisonous trade? The farewells of mother and daughter-in-law were cold. During the 3 weeks that they had been together, they had not exchanged half a dozen words, apart from the inquiries and phrases when they met at table, and in the evening before going to bed. Madame Bovary left on a Wednesday, the market day at Yonville. The place since morning had been blocked by a row of carts, which, on end and their shafts in the air, spread all along the line of houses from the church to the inn. On the other side there were canvas booths, where cotton checks, blankets, and woolen stockings were sold, together with harness for horses, and packets of blue ribbon, whose ends fluttered in the wind. The coarse hardware was spread out on the ground between pyramids of eggs and hampers of cheeses, from which sticky straw stuck out. Near the corn machines, clucking hens passed their necks through the bars of flat cages. The people, crowding in the same place and unwilling to move thence, sometimes threatened to smash the shop front of the chemist. On Wednesdays his shop was never empty, and the people pushed in less to buy drugs than for consultations. So great was Homais' reputation in the neighbouring villages. His robust aplomb had fascinated the rustics. They considered him a greater doctor than all the doctors. Emma was leaning out at the window. She was often there. The window in the provinces replaces the theatre and the promenade. She was amusing herself with watching the crowd of boors, when she saw a gentleman in a green velvet coat. He had on yellow gloves, although he wore heavy gaiters. He was coming toward the doctor's house, followed by a peasant walking with a bent head and quite a thoughtful air. "Can I see the doctor?" he asked Justine, who was talking on the doorsteps with Félicité, and taking him for a servant of the house, "Tell him that Monsieur Rodolphe Boulanger of La Huchette is here." It was not from territorial vanity that the new arrival added "of La Huchette," to his name, but to make himself the better known. La Huchette, in fact, was an estate near Yonville, where he had just bought the chateau and 2 farms that he cultivated himself, without, however, troubling very much about them. He lived as a bachelor, and was supposed to have at least 15,000 francs a year. Charles came into the room. Monsieur Boulanger introduced his man, who wanted to be bled because he felt a tingling all over. "That'll purge me," he urged, as an objection to all reasoning. So Bovary ordered a bandage and a basin, and asked Justine to hold it. Then addressing the peasant, who was already pale, "Don't be afraid, my lad." "No, no, sir," said the other. "Get on." And with an air of bravado he held out his great arm. At the prick of the lancet the blood spurted out, splashing against the looking-glass. "Hold the basin nearer!" exclaimed Charles. "Lor," said the peasant, "one would swear it was a little fountain flowing. How red my blood is! That's a good sign, isn't it?" "Sometimes," answered the doctor, "one feels nothing at first, and then syncope sets in, and more especially with people of strong constitution like this man." At these words the rustic let go the lancet case he was twisting between his fingers. A shudder of his shoulders made the chair back creak. His hat fell off. "I thought as much," said Bovary, pressing his finger on the vein. The basin was beginning to tremble in Justine's hands. His knees shook. He turned pale. "Emma! Emma!" called Charles. With one bound she came down the staircase. "Some vinegar!" he cried. "Oh, dear! 2 at once!" And in his emotion he could hardly put on the compress. "It is nothing," said Monsieur Boulanger quietly, taking Justine in his arms. He seated him on the table, with his back resting against the wall. Madame Bovary began taking off his cravat. The strings of his shirt had got into a knot, and she was for some minutes moving her light fingers about the young fellow's neck. Then she poured some vinegar on her cambric handkerchief. She moistened his temples with little dabs, and then blew upon them softly. The ploughman revived, but Justine's syncope still lasted, and his eyeballs disappeared in the pale sclerotics like blue flowers in milk. "We must hide this from him," said Charles. Madame Bovary took the basin to put it under the table. With the movement she made in bending down, her dress, it was a summer dress with 4 flounces, yellow, long in the waist and wide in the skirt, spread out under her on the flags of the room, and as Emma, stooping, staggered a little as she stretched out her arms. The stuff here and there gave with the inflections of her bust. Then she went to fetch a bottle of water, and she was melting some pieces of sugar when the chemist arrived. The servant had been sent to fetch him in the tumult. Seeing his pupil's eyes staring, he drew a long breath. Then going around him, he looked at him from head to foot. "Fool," he said, "really a little fool. A fool in 4 letters. A phlebotomy's a big affair, isn't it? And a fellow who isn't afraid of anything. A kind of squirrel, just as he is who climbs to vertiginous heights to shake down nuts. Oh, yes, you just talk to me, boast about yourself. Here's a fine fitness for practicing pharmacy later on. For under serious circumstances you may be called before the tribunals, in order to enlighten the minds of the magistrates, and you would have to keep your head then to reason, show yourself a man, or else pass for an imbecile." Justine did not answer. The chemist went on. "Who asked you to come? You're always pestering the doctor and madame. On Wednesday, moreover, your presence is indispensable to me. There are now 20 people in the shop. I left everything because of the interest I take in you. Come, get along, sharp. Wait for me, and keep an eye on the jars." When Justine, who was rearranging his dress, had gone, they talked for a little while about fainting fits. Madame Bovary had never fainted. "That is extraordinary for a lady," said Monsieur Boulanger. "But some people are very susceptible. Thus in a duel, I have seen a second lose consciousness at the mere sound of the loading of pistols." "For my part," said the chemist, "the sight of other people's blood doesn't affect me at all, but the mere thought of my own flowing would make me faint if I reflected upon it too much." Monsieur Boulanger, however, dismissed his servant, advising him to calm himself, since his fancy was over. "It procured me the advantage of making your acquaintance," he added, and he looked at Emma as he said this. Then he put 3 francs on the corner of the table, bowed negligently, and went out. He was soon on the other side of the river. This was his way back to La Huchette, and Emma saw him in the meadow, walking under the poplars, slackening his pace now and then, as one who reflects. "She is very pretty," he said to himself. "She is very pretty, this doctor's wife. Fine teeth, black eyes, a dainty foot, a figure like a Parisienne's. Where the devil does she come from? Wherever did that fat fellow pick her up?" Monsieur Rodolphe Boulanger was 34. He was of brutal temperament and intelligent perspicacity, having, moreover, had much to do with women, and knowing them well. This one had seemed pretty to him. So he was thinking about her and her husband. "I think he is very stupid. She is tired of him, no doubt. He has dirty nails and hasn't shaved for 3 days. While he is trotting after his patients, she sits there botching socks, and she gets bored. She would like to live in town and dance polkas every evening. Poor little woman. She's gaping after love like a carp after water on a kitchen table. With 3 words of gallantry she'd adore one, I'm sure of it. She'd be tender, charming, yes, but how to get rid of her afterwards?" Then the difficulties of love-making, seen in the distance, made him by contrast think of his mistress. She was an actress at Rouen, whom he kept. And when he had pondered over this image, with which, even in remembrance, he was satiated, "Ah, Madame Bovary," he thought, "is much prettier, especially fresher. Virginie is decidedly beginning to grow fat. She is so finicky about her pleasures, and besides, she has a mania for prawns." The fields were empty, and around him Rodolphe heard only the regular beating of the grass striking against his boots, with the cry of the grasshopper hidden at a distance among the oats. He again saw Emma in her room, dressed as he had seen her, and he undressed her. "Oh, I will have her!" he cried, striking a blow with his stick at a clod in front of him, and he at once began to consider the political part of the enterprise. He asked himself, "Where shall we meet? By what means? We shall always be having the brat on our hands, and the servant, the neighbours, and husband, all sorts of worries. Pshaw! One would lose too much time over it." Then he resumed, "She really has eyes that pierce one's heart like a gimlet. And that pale complexion! I adore pale women." When he reached the top of the Arguelles hills, he had made up his mind. "It's only finding the opportunities. Well, I will call in now and then. I'll send them venison, poultry. I'll have myself bled, if need be. We shall become friends. I'll invite them to my place. By Jove," added he, "there's the agricultural show coming on. She'll be there. I shall see her. We'll begin boldly, for that's the surest way." End of Part 2, Chapter 7.
To Chapter 8 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Icy Jumbo. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 8. At last it came, the famous agricultural show. On the morning of the solemnity, all the inhabitants at their doors were chatting over the preparations. The pediment of the town hall had been hung with garlands of ivy. A tent had been erected in a meadow for the banquet, and in the middle of the place, in front of the church, a kind of bombard was to announce the arrival of the prefect and the names of the successful farmers who had obtained prizes. The National Guard of Buchy, there was none at Yonville, had come to join the corps of firemen, of whom Binet was the captain. On that day he wore a collar even higher than usual, and tightly buttoned in his tunic, his figure was so stiff and motionless that the whole vital portion of his person seemed to have descended into his legs, which rose in a cadence of set steps with a single movement. As there was some rivalry between the tax-collector and the colonel, both, to show off their talents, drilled their men separately. One saw the red epaulettes and the black breastplates pass and repass alternately. There was no end to it, and it constantly began again. There had never been such a display of pomp. Several citizens had scoured their houses the evening before, tricoloured flags hung from half-open windows, all the public houses were full, and in the lovely weather the starched caps, the golden crosses, and the coloured neckerchiefs seemed whiter than snow, shone in the sun, and relieved with the motley colours the sombre monotony of the frock coats and blue smocks. The neighbouring farmers' wives, when they got off their horses, pulled out the long pins that fastened around them their dresses, turned up for fear of mud, and the husbands, for their part, in order to save their hats, kept their handkerchiefs around them, holding one corner between their teeth. The crowd came into the main street from both ends of the village. People poured in from the lanes, the alleys, the houses, and from time to time one heard knockers banging against doors, closing behind women with their gloves, who were going out to see the fete. What was most admired were two long lampstands covered with lanterns that flanked a platform on which the authorities were to sit. Besides this, there were against the 4 columns of the town hall 4 kinds of poles, each bearing a small standard of greenish cloth, embellished with inscriptions in gold letters. On one was written, "To Commerce," on the other, "To Agriculture," on the third, "To Industry," and on the fourth, "To the Fine Arts." But the jubilation that brightened all faces seemed to darken that of Madame Lefrançois, the innkeeper. Standing on her kitchen steps, she muttered to herself, "What rubbish, what rubbish! With their canvas booth! Do you think the prefect will be glad to dine down there under a tent like a gipsy? They call all this fussing doing good to the place. Then it wasn't worth while sending to Neufchâtel for the keeper of a cook-shop. And for whom? For cowherds. Tatterdemalions." The druggist was passing. He had on a frock-coat, nankeen trousers, beaver shoes, and for a wonder a hat with a low crown. "Your servant. Excuse me, I'm in a hurry." And as the fat widow asked where he was going, "It seems odd to you, doesn't it? I, who am always more cooped up in my laboratory than the man's rat in his cheese." "What cheese?" asked the landlady. "Oh, nothing, nothing," Homais continued. "I merely wished to convey to you, Madame Lefrançois, that I usually live at home like a recluse. To-day, however, considering the circumstances, it is necessary—" "Oh, you're going down there," she said, contemptuously. "Yes, I'm going," replied the druggist, astonished. "Am I not a member of the Consulting Commission?" Mère Lefrançois looked at him for a few moments, and ended by saying with a smile, "That's another pair of shoes. But what does agriculture matter to you? Do you understand anything about it?" "Certainly I understand it, since I am a druggist, that is to say, a chemist, and the object of chemistry, Madame Lefrançois, being the knowledge of the reciprocal and molecular action of all natural bodies, it follows that agriculture is comprised within its domain. And, in fact, the composition of the manure, the fermentation of liquids, the analyses of gases, and the influence of miasmata, what, I ask you, is all this, if it isn't chemistry, pure and simple?" The landlady did not answer. Homais went on, "Do you think that to be an agriculturalist it is necessary to have tilled the earth or fattened fowls oneself? It is necessary, rather, to know the composition of the substances in question, the geological strata, the atmospheric conditions, the quality of the soil, the minerals, the waters, the density of the different bodies, their capillarity and what not. And one must be master of all the principles of hygiene in order to direct, criticise the construction of buildings, the feeding of animals, the diet of domestics. And, moreover, Madame Lefrançois, one must know botany, be able to distinguish between plants, you understand, which are the wholesome and those that are deleterious, which are unproductive and which nutritive, if it is well to pull them up here and re-sow them there, to propagate some, destroy others, In brief, one must keep pace with science by means of pamphlets and public papers, be always on the alert to find out improvements. The landlady never took her eyes off the Café François, and the chemist went on. Would to God our agriculturists were chemists, or that at least they would pay more attention to the counsels of science. Thus lately I myself wrote a considerable tract, a memoir of over 72 pages, entitled Cider, its Manufacture and its Effects, together with some new reflections on the subject, that I sent to the Agricultural Society of Rouen, and which even procured me the honour of being received among its members, section agriculture, class pomological. Well, if my work had been given to the public— But the druggist stopped. Madame Lefrançois seemed so preoccupied. "Just look at them," she said. "It's past comprehension. Such a cookshop as that!" And with a shrug of the shoulders that stretched out over her breast the stitches of her knitted bodice, she pointed with both hands at her rival's inn, whence songs were heard issuing. "Well, it won't last long," she added. "It'll be over before a week." Homais drew back with stupefaction. She came down 3 steps and whispered in his ear, "What? You didn't know it? There is to be an execution in next week. It's Lheureux who is selling him out. He has killed him with bills." "What a terrible catastrophe!" cried the druggist, who always found expressions in harmony with all imaginable circumstances. Then the landlady began telling him the story that she had heard from Théodore, Monsieur Guillaumin's servant, and although she detested Tellier, she blamed Lheureux. He was a wheedler, a sneak. "There," she said, "look at him. He is in the market. He is bowing to Madame Bovary, who's got on a green bonnet. Why, she's taking Monsieur Boulanger's arm." "Madame Bovary!" exclaimed Homais. "I must go at once and pay her my respects. Perhaps she'll be very glad to have a seat in the enclosure under the peristyle." And without heeding Madame Lefrançois, who was calling him back to tell him more about it, the druggist walked off rapidly with a smile on his lips, with straight knees, bowing copiously to right and left, and taking up much room with the large tails of his frock-coat that fluttered behind him in the wind. Rodolphe, having caught sight of him from afar, hurried on, but Madame Bovary lost her breath, so he walked more slowly, and, smiling at her, said in a rough tone, "It's only to get away from that fat fellow, you know, the druggist." She pressed his elbow. "What's the meaning of that?" he asked himself, and he looked at her out of the corner of his eyes. Her profile was so calm that one could guess nothing from it. It stood out in the light from the oval of her bonnet, with pale ribbons on it like the leaves of weeds. Her eyes, with their long curved lashes, looked straight before her, and though wide open, they seemed slightly puckered by the cheek-bones because of the blood pulsing gently under the delicate skin. A pink line ran along the partition between her nostrils. Her head was bent upon her shoulder, and the pearl tips of her white teeth were seen between her lips. "Is she making fun of me?" thought Rodolphe. Emma's gesture, however, had only been meant for a warning, for Monsieur Lheureux was accompanying them, and spoke now and again as if to enter into the conversation. "What a superb day! Everybody is out. The wind is east." And neither Madame Bovary nor Rodolphe answered him, whilst at the slightest movement made by them he drew near, saying, "I beg your pardon," and raised his hat. When they reached the farrier's house, instead of following the road up to the fence, Rodolphe suddenly turned down a path, drawing with him Madame Bovary. He called out, "Good evening, Monsieur Lheureux. See you again presently." "How you got rid of him," she said, laughing. "Why," he went on, "allow oneself to be intruded upon by others. And as to-day I have the happiness of being with you." Emma blushed. He did not finish his sentence. Then he talked of the fine weather, and of the pleasure of walking on the grass. A few daisies had sprung up again. "Here are some pretty Easter daisies," he said, "and enough of them to furnish oracles to all the amorous maids in the place." He added, "Shall I pick some? What do you think?" "Are you in love?" she asked, coughing a little. "Who knows?" answered Rodolphe. The meadow began to fill, and the housewives hustled you with their great umbrellas, their baskets, and their babies. One had often to get out of the way of a long file of country folk, servant maids with blue stockings, flat shoes, silver rings, and who smelt of milk when one passed close to them. They walked along, holding one another by the hand, and thus they spread over the whole field from the row of open trees to the banquet tent. But this was the examination time, and the farmers, one after the other, entered a kind of enclosure formed by a long cord supported on sticks. The beasts were there, their noses towards the cord, and making a confused line with their unequal rumps. Drowsy pigs were burrowing in the earth with their snouts. Calves were bleating, lambs baying. The cows, on knees folded in, were stretching their bellies on the grass, slowly chewing the cud, and blinking their heavy eyelids at the gnats that buzzed round them. Ploughmen, with bare arms, were holding by the halter prancing stallions that neighed with dilated nostrils looking towards the mares. These stood quietly, stretching out their heads and flowing manes, while their foals rested in the shadow, or now and again came and sucked them. And above the long undulation of these crowded animals one saw some white mane rising in the wind like a wave, or some sharp horns sticking out, and the heads of men running about. Apart, outside the enclosure, 100 paces off, was a large black bull, muzzled, with an iron ring in his nostrils, and who moved no more than if he had been in bronze. A child in rags was holding him by a rope. Between the two lines the committee men were walking with heavy steps, examining each animal, then consulting one another in a low voice. One who seemed of more importance now and then took notes in a book as he walked along. This was the president of the jury, Monsieur de Roseraille de la Panville. As soon as he recognized Rodolphe, he came forward quickly, and smiling amiably said, "What, Monsieur Boulanger? You are deserting us?" Rodolphe protested that he was just coming, but when the president had disappeared, "Ma foi," said he, "I shall not go. Your company is better than his." And while poking fun at the show, Rodolphe, to move about more easily, showed the gendarme his blue card, and even stopped now and then in front of some fine beast, which Madame Bovary did not at all admire. He noticed this, and began jeering at the Yonville ladies and their dresses. Then he apologized for the negligence of his own. He had that incongruity of common and elegant in which the habitually vulgar think they see the revelation of an eccentric existence, of the perturbations of sentiment, the tyrannies of art, and always a certain contempt for social conventions that seduces or exasperates them. Thus his cambric shirt with plaited cuffs was blown out by the wind in the opening of his waistcoat of grey ticking, and his broad striped trousers disclosed at the ankle nankeen boots with patent leather gaiters. These were so polished that they reflected the grass. He trampled on horses' dung with them, one hand in the pocket of his jacket, and his straw hat on one side. "Besides," added he, "when one lives in the country, it's a waste of time," said Emma. "That is true," replied Rodolphe. "To think that not one of these people is capable of understanding even the cut of a coat." Then they talked about provincial mediocrity, of the lives it crushed, the illusions lost there. "And I too," said Rodolphe, "am drifting into depression." "You?" she said in astonishment. "I thought you very light-hearted." "Ah, yes, I seem so, because in the midst of the world I know how to wear the mask of a scoffer upon my face. And yet, how many a time, at the sight of a cemetery by moonlight, have I not asked myself whether it were not better to join those sleeping there?" "Oh, and your friends?" she said. "You do not think of them?" "My friends! What friends? Have I any? Who cares for me?" And he accompanied the last words with a kind of whistling of the lips. But they were obliged to separate from each other, because of a great pile of chairs that a man was carrying behind them. He was so overladen with them that one could only see the tips of his wooden shoes and the ends of his two outstretched arms. It was Lestiboudois, the grave-digger, who was carrying the church chairs about amongst the people. Alive to all that concerned his interests, he had hit upon this means of turning the show to account, and his idea was succeeding, for he no longer knew which way to turn. In fact, the villagers, who were hot, quarrelled for these seats, whose straw smelt of incense, and they leant against the thick backs, stained with the wax of candles, with a certain veneration. Madame Bovary again took Rodolphe's arm. He went on, as if speaking to himself. "Yes, I have missed so many things, always alone. Ah, if I had some aim in life, if I had met some love, if I had found someone. Oh, how I would have spent all the energy of which I am capable, surmounted everything, overcome everything." "Yet it seems to me," said Emma, "that you are not to be pitied." "Ah, you think so?" said Rodolphe. "For after all," she went on, "you are free." She hesitated. "Rich." "Do not mock me," he replied. And she protested that she was not mocking him, when the report of a cannon resounded. Immediately all began hustling one another pell-mell towards the village. It was a false alarm. The prefect seemed not to be coming, and the members of the jury felt much embarrassed, not knowing if they ought to begin the meeting or still wait. At last, at the end of the place, a large hired landau appeared, drawn by 2 thin horses, which a coachman in a white hat was whipping lustily. Binet had only just time to shout, "Present arms!" and the colonel to imitate him. All ran towards the enclosure. Every one pushed forward. A few even forgot their collars, but the equipage of the prefect seemed to anticipate the crowd, and the 2 yoked jades, traipsing in their harness, came up at a little trot in front of the peristyle of the town hall at the very moment when the National Guard and firemen deployed, beating drums and marking time. "Present!" shouted Binet. "Halt!" shouted the colonel. "Left about! March!" And after presenting arms, during which the clang of the band, letting loose, rang out like a brass kettle rolling downstairs, all the guns were lowered. Then was seen, stepping down from the carriage, a gentleman in a short coat with silver braiding, with a bald brow, and wearing a tuft of hair at the back of his head, of a sallow complexion and the most benign appearance. His eyes, very large and covered by heavy lids, were half closed to look at the crowd, while at the same time he raised his sharp nose and forced a smile upon his sunken mouth. He recognized the mayor by his scarf, and explained to him that the prefect was not able to come. He himself was a councillor at the prefecture. Then he added a few apologies. Monsieur Tuvache answered them with compliments. The other confessed himself nervous, and they remained thus, face to face, their foreheads almost touching, with the members of the jury all round, the municipal council, the notable personages, the National Guard, and the crowd. The councillor, pressing his little cocked hat to his breast, repeated his bows, while Tuvache, bent like a bow, also smiled, stammered, tried to say something, protested his devotion to the monarchy, and the honour that was being done to Yonville. Hippolyte, the groom from the inn, took the head of the horses from the coachman, and, limping along with his club foot, led them to the door of the Lion d'Or, where a number of peasants collected to look at the carriage. The drum beat, the howitzer thundered, and the gentlemen one by one mounted the platform, where they sat down in red Utrecht velvet armchairs that had been lent by Madame Tuvache. All these people looked alike. Their fair flabby faces, somewhat tanned by the sun, were the colour of sweet cider, and their puffy whiskers emerged from stiff collars, kept up by white cravats with broad bows. All the waistcoats were of velvet, double-breasted. All the watches had, at the end of a long ribbon, an oval cornelian seal. Every one rested his 2 hands on his thighs, carefully stretching the stride of their trousers, whose unsponged glossy cloth shone more brilliantly than the leather of their heavy boots. The ladies of the company stood at the back under the vestibule between the pillars, while the common herd was opposite, standing up or sitting on chairs. As a matter of fact, Lestiboudois had brought thither all those that he had moved from the field, and he even kept running back every minute to fetch others from the church. He caused such confusion with this piece of business that one had great difficulty in getting to the small steps of the platform. "I think," said Monsieur Lheureux to the chemist, who was passing to his place, "that they ought to have put up 2 Venetian masts, with something rather severe and rich for ornaments. It would have been a very pretty effect." "To be sure," replied Homais, "but what can you expect? The mayor took everything on his own shoulders. He hasn't much taste. Poor Tuvache! And he is even completely destitute of what is called the genius of art." Rodolphe, meanwhile, with Madame Bovary, had gone up to the first floor of the town hall, to the council room, and as it was empty, he declared that they could enjoy the sight there more comfortably. He fetched 3 stools from the round table under the bust of the monarch, and having carried them to one of the windows, they sat down by each other. There was a commotion on the platform, long whisperings, much parleying. At last the councillor got up. They knew now that his name was Lieuvain, and in the crowd the name was passed from one to the other. After he had collated a few pages, and bent over them to see better, he began. "Gentlemen, may I be permitted, first of all, before addressing you on the object of our meeting today, and this sentiment will, I am sure, be shared by you all, may I be permitted, I say, to pay a tribute to the higher administration, to the government, to the monarch, gentle men, our sovereign, to that beloved king, to whom no branch of public or private prosperity is a matter of indifference, and who directs with a hand at once so firm and wise the chariot of the state amid the incessant perils of the stormy sea, knowing, moreover, how to make peace respected as well as war, industry, commerce, agriculture, and the fine arts." "I ought," said Rodolphe, "to get back a little further." "Why?" said Emma. But at this moment the voice of the councillor rose to an extraordinary pitch. He declaimed, "This is no longer the time, gentlemen, when civil discord ensanguined our public places, when the landlord, the business man, the working man himself, falling asleep at night, lying down to peaceful sleep, trembled lest he should be awakened suddenly by the noise of incendiary tocsins, when the most subversive doctrines audaciously sapped foundations." "Well, someone down there might see me," Rodolphe resumed. "Then I should have to invent excuses for a fortnight, and with my bad reputation—" "Oh, you are slandering yourself," said Emma. "No, it is dreadful, I assure you." "But, gentlemen," continued the councillor, "if, banishing from my memory the remembrance of these sad pictures, I carry my eyes back to the actual situation of our dear country, what do I see there? Everywhere commerce and the fine arts are flourishing. Everywhere new means of communication, like so many new arteries in the body of the state, establish within it new relations. Our great industrial centres have recovered all their activity. Religion, more consolidated, smiles in all hearts. Our ports are full. Confidence is born again, and France breathes once more." "Besides," added Rodolphe, "perhaps from the world's point of view they are right." "How so?" she asked. "What?" said he. "Do you not know that there are souls constantly tormented? They need by turns to dream and to act, the purest passions and the most turbulent joys, and thus they fling themselves into all sorts of fantasies, of follies." Then she looked at him as one looks at a traveller who has voyaged over strange lands, and went on, "We have not even this distraction, we poor women. A sad distraction, for happiness isn't found in it." "But is it ever found?" she asked. "Yes, one day it comes," he answered. "And this is what you have understood," said the councillor. "You farmers, agricultural labourers, you pacific pioneers of a work that belongs wholly to civilization, you men of progress and morality, You have understood, I say, that political storms are even more redoubtable than atmospheric disturbances. It comes one day, repeated Rodolphe, one day suddenly, and when one is despairing of it, then the horizon expands. It is as if a voice cried, "It is here!" You feel the need of confiding the whole of your life, of giving everything, sacrificing everything to this being. There is no need for explanations. They understand one another. They have seen each other in dreams. And he looked at her. In fine, here it is, this treasure so sought after, here before you. It glitters, it flashes, yet one still doubts, one does not believe it. One remains dazzled, as if one went out from darkness into light. And as he ended, Rodolphe suited the action to the word. He passed his hand over his face, like a man seized with giddiness. Then he let it fall on Emma's. She took hers away. And who would be surprised at it, gentlemen? He only who is so blind, so plunged, I do not fear to say it, so plunged in the prejudices of another age as to misunderstand the spirit of agricultural populations. Where, indeed, is to be found more patriotism than in the country, greater devotion to the public welfare, more intelligence, in a word? And, gentlemen, I do not mean that superficial intelligence, vain ornament of idle minds, but rather that profound and balanced intelligence that applies itself above all to useful objects, thus contributing to the good of all, to the common amelioration, and to the support of the state, born of respect for law and the practice of duty. Ah, again, said Rodolphe, always duty. I am sick of the word. They are a lot of old blockheads in flannel vests, and of old women with foot-warmers and rosaries, who constantly drone into our ears, duty, duty. Ah, by Jove, one's duty is to feel what is great, cherish the beautiful, and not accept all the conventions of society with the ignominy that it imposes upon us. Yet, objected Madame Bovary, no, why cry out against the passions? Are they not the one beautiful thing on the earth, the source of heroism, of enthusiasm, of poetry, music, the arts, of everything, in a word? But one must, said Emma, to some extent bow to the opinion of the world and accept its moral code. Ah, but there are two, he replied, the small, the conventional, that of men, that which constantly challenges, that brays out so loudly, that makes such a commotion here below, of the earth earthly, like the mass of imbeciles you see down there, but the other, the eternal, that is about us and above, like the landscape that surrounds us, and the blue heavens that give us light. Monsieur Lieuvain had just wiped his mouth with a pocket-handkerchief. He continued, "And what should I do here, gentlemen, pointing out to you the uses of agriculture? Who supplies our wants? Who provides our means of subsistence? Is it not the agriculturist? The agriculturist, gentlemen, who, sowing with laborious hand the fertile furrows of the country, brings forth the corn, which, being ground, is made into a powder by means of ingenious machinery, comes out thence under the name of flour, and from there, transported to our cities, is soon delivered at the baker's, who makes it into food for poor and rich alike. Again, is it not the agriculturist who fattens for our clothes his abundant flocks in the pastures? For how should we clothe ourselves, how nourish ourselves, without the agriculturist? And, gentlemen, is it even necessary to go so far for examples? Who has not frequently reflected on all the momentous things that we get out of that modest animal, the ornament of poultry yards, that provides us at once with a soft pillow for our bed, with succulent flesh for our tables, and eggs? But I should never end if I were to enumerate one after the other all the different products which the earth, well cultivated, like a generous mother, lavishes upon her children. Here it is the vine, elsewhere the apple tree for cider, there colza, Further on, cheeses and flax. Gentlemen, let us not forget flax, which has made such great strides of late years, and to which I will more particularly call your attention. He had no need to call it, for all the mouths of the multitude were wide open, as if to drink in his words. Tuvache, by his side, listened to him with staring eyes. Monsieur de Roseray from time to time softly closed his eyelids, and farther on the chemist, with his son Napoleon between his knees, put his hand behind his ear in order not to lose a syllable. The chins of the other members of the jury went slowly up and down in their waistcoats in sign of approval. The firemen at the foot of the platform rested on their bayonets, and Binet, motionless, stood with out-turned elbows, the point of his sabre in the air. Perhaps he could hear, but certainly he could see nothing, because of the visor of his helmet that fell down on his nose. His lieutenant, the youngest son of Monsieur Tuvache, had a bigger one, for his was enormous and shook on his head, and from it an end of his cotton scarf peeped out. He smiled beneath it with a perfectly infantine sweetness, and his pale little face, whence drops were running, wore an expression of enjoyment and sleepiness. The square, as far as the houses, was crowded with people. One saw folk leaning on their elbows at all the windows, others standing at doors, and Justin, in front of the chemist's shop, seemed quite transfixed by the sight of what he was looking at. In spite of the silence, Monsieur Lieuvein's voice was lost in the air. It reached you in fragments of phrases, and interrupted here and there by the creaking of chairs in the crowd. Then you suddenly heard the long bellowing of an ox, or else the bleating of lambs, who answered one another at street corners. In fact, the cowherds and shepherds had driven their beasts thus far, and these lowed from time to time, while with their tongues they tore down some scrap of foliage that hung above their mouths. Rodolphe had drawn nearer to Emma, and said to her in a low voice, speaking rapidly, "Does not this conspiracy of the world revolt you? Is there a single sentiment it does not condemn? The noblest instincts, the purest sympathies are persecuted, slandered, and if at length two poor souls do meet, all is so organized that they cannot blend together. Yet they will make the attempt, they will flutter their wings, they will call upon each other. Oh, no matter, sooner or later, in 6 months, 10 years, they will come together, will love, for fate has decreed it, and they are born one for the other." His arms were folded across his knees, and thus lifting his face towards Emma, close by her, he looked fixedly at her. She noticed in his eyes small golden lines radiating from black pupils. She even smelt the perfume of the pomade that made his hair glossy. Then a faintness came over her. She recalled the Viscount who had waltzed with her at Vaubyessard, and his beard exhaled like this air an odour of vanilla and citron, and mechanically she half closed her eyes the better to breathe it in. But in making this movement, as she leant back in her chair, she saw in the distance, right on the line of the horizon, the old diligence, the hirondelle that was slowly descending the hill of Le, dragging after it a long trail of dust. It was in this yellow carriage that Léon had so often come back to her, and by this route down there that he had gone for ever. She fancied she saw him opposite at his windows, then all grew confused. Clouds gathered. It seemed to her that she was again turning in the waltz, under the light of the lustres, on the arm of the Viscount, and that Léon was not far away, that he was coming, and yet all the time she was conscious of the scent of Rodolphe's head by her side. This sweetness of sensation pierced through her old desires, and these, like grains of sand under a gust of wind, eddied to and fro in the subtle breath of the perfume which suffused her soul. She opened wide her nostrils several times to drink in the freshness of the ivy round the capitals. She took off her gloves. She wiped her hands, then fanned her face with her handkerchief. while athwart the throbbing of her temples she heard the murmur of the crowd and the voice of the counsellor intoning his phrases. He said, "Continue, persevere, listen neither to the suggestions of routine nor to the over-hasty counsels of a rash empiricism. Apply yourselves, above all, to the amelioration of the soil, to good manures, to the development of the equine, bovine, ovine, and porcine races. Let these shows be to you pacific arenas, where the victor in leaving it will hold forth a hand to the vanquished, and will fraternize with him in the hope of better success. And you, aged servants, humble domestics, whose hard labour no government up to this day has taken into consideration, come hither to receive the reward of your silent virtues, and be assured that the state henceforward has its eye upon you, that it encourages you, protects you, that it will accede to your just demands, and alleviate as much as in it lies the burden of your painful sacrifices." Monsieur Lieuvain then sat down. Monsieur de Roseray got up, beginning another speech. His was not perhaps so florid as that of the counsellor, but it recommended itself by a more direct style, that is to say, by more special knowledge and more elevated considerations. Thus the praise of the government took up less space in it, religion and agriculture more. He showed in it the relations of these two, and how they had always contributed to civilization. Rodolphe, with Madame Bovary, was talking dreams, presentiments, magnetism. Going back to the cradle of society, the orator painted those fierce times when men lived on acorns in the heart of woods. Then they had left off the skins of beast, had put on cloth, tilled the soil, planted the vine. Was this a good? And in this discovery was there not more of injury than of gain? Monsieur de Roseray set himself this problem. From magnetism, little by little, Rodolphe had come to affinities, and while the president was citing Cincinnatus and his plough, Diocletian planting his cabbages, and the Emperor of China inaugurating the year by the sowing of the seed, the young man was explaining to the young woman that these irresistible attractions find their cause in some previous state of existence. Thus we, he said, why did we come to know one another? What chance willed it? It was because across the infinite, like two streams that flow but to unite, our special bents of mind had driven us towards each other. And he seized her hand. She did not withdraw it. "For good farming generally," cried the president. "Just now, for example, when I went to your house, to Monsieur Bizat of Quincampoix. Did I know I should accompany you? 70 francs! 100 times I wished to go, and I followed you, I remained. Manures! And I shall remain tonight, tomorrow, all other days, all my life. To Monsieur Caron of Argueil, a gold medal! For I have never in the society of any other person found so complete a charm. To Monsieur Bain of Givry-Saint-Martin, and I shall carry away with me the remembrance of you. For a merino ram! But you will forget me. I shall pass away like a shadow. To Monsieur Boulot of Notre-Dame. Oh no, I shall be something in your thought, in your life, shall I not? Porcine race, prizes, equal, to Messieurs Le Héris and Culembourg, 60 francs. Rodolphe was pressing her hand, and he felt it all warm and quivering like a captive dove that wants to fly away. But whether she was trying to take it away, or whether she was answering his pressure, she made a movement with her fingers. He exclaimed, "Oh, I thank you! You do not repulse me. You are good. You understand that I am yours. Let me look at you. Let me contemplate you." A gust of wind that blew in at the window ruffled the cloth on the table, and in the square below all the great caps of the peasant women were uplifted by it, like the wings of white butterflies fluttering. "Use of oil cakes," continued the president. He was hurrying on. Flemish manure, flax growing, drainage, long leases, domestic service. Rodolphe was no longer speaking. They looked at one another. A supreme desire made their dry lips tremble, and wearily, without an effort, their fingers intertwined. Catherine Nicaise Elisabeth Leroux of Sasteau-la-Guerrière, for 54 years of service at the same farm, a silver medal, value 25 francs. Where is Catherine Leroux? Repeated the counsellor. She did not present herself, and one could hear voices whispering, Go up! Don't be afraid! Oh, how stupid she is! Well, is she there? Cried Tuvache. Yes, here she is. Then let her come up. Then there came forward on the platform a little old woman with timid bearing, who seemed to shrink within her poor clothes. On her feet she wore heavy wooden clogs, and from her hips hung a large blue apron. Her pale face, framed in a borderless cap, was more wrinkled than a withered russet apple, and from the sleeves of her red jacket looked out 2 large hands with knotty joints. The dust of barns, the potash of washing the grease of wools had so encrusted, roughened, hardened these, that they seemed dirty, although they had been rinsed in clear water, and by dint of long service they remained half open, as if to bear humble witness for themselves of so much suffering endured. Something of monastic rigidity dignified her face. Nothing of sadness or of emotion weakened that pale look. In her constant living with animals she had caught their dumbness and their calm. It was the first time that she had found herself in the midst of so large a company, and inwardly scared by the flags, the drums, the gentlemen in frock-coats, and the order of the counsellor, she stood motionless, not knowing whether to advance or run away, nor why the crowd was pushing her, and the jury were smiling at her. Thus stood before these radiant bourgeois this half-century of servitude. "Approach, venerable Catherine Nicaise Elisabeth Leroux," said the counsellor, who had taken the list of prize-winners from the president, and, looking at the piece of paper and the old woman by turns, he repeated in a fatherly tone, "Approach, approach." "Are you deaf?" said Tuvache, fiddling in his armchair, and he began shouting in her ear, 54 years of service, a silver medal, 25 francs, for you." Then, when she had her medal, she looked at it, and as she walked away they could hear her muttering, "I'll give it to our curé up home to say some masses for me." "What fanaticism!" exclaimed the chemist, leaning across to the notary. The meeting was over. The crowd dispersed, and now that the speeches had been read, each one fell back into his place again, and everything into the old grooves. The masters bullied the servants, and these struck the animals, indolent victors, going back to the stalls, a green crown on their horns. The National Guards, however, had gone up to the first floor of the town hall with buns spitted on their bayonets, and the drummer of the battalion carried a basket with bottles. Madame Bovary took Rodolphe's arm. He saw her home. They separated at her door. Then he walked about alone in the meadow while he waited for the time of the banquet. The feast was long, noisy, ill-served. The guests were so crowded that they could hardly move their elbows, and the narrow planks used for forms almost broke down under their weight. They ate hugely. Each one stuffed himself on his own account. Sweat stood on every brow, and a whitish steam, like the vapour of a stream on an autumn morning, floated above the table between the hanging lamps. Rodolphe, leaning against the calico of the tent, was thinking so earnestly of Emma that he heard nothing. Behind him on the grass the servants were piling up the dirty plates. His neighbours were talking. He did not answer them. They filled his glass, and there was silence in his thoughts in spite of the growing noise. He was dreaming of what she had said, of the line of her lips, her face, as in a magic mirror, shone on the plates of the shakos, the folds of her gown fell along the walls, and days of love unrolled to all infinity before him in the vistas of the future. He saw her again in the evening during the fireworks, but she was with her husband, Madame Homais, and the druggist, who was worrying about the danger of stray rockets, and every moment he left the company to go and give some advice to Binet. The pyrotechnic pieces sent to Monsieur Tuvache had, through an excess of caution, been shut up in his cellar, and so the damp powder would not light, and the principal set piece, that was to represent a dragon biting his tail, failed completely. Now and then a meagre Roman candle went off. Then the gaping crowd sent up a shout that mingled with the cry of the women, whose waists were being squeezed in the darkness. Emma silently nestled against Charles's shoulder. Then, raising her chin, she watched the luminous rays of the rockets against the dark sky. Rodolphe gazed at her in the light of the burning lanterns. They went out one by one. The stars shone out. A few crops of rain began to fall. She knotted her fichu round her bare head. At this moment the councillor's carriage came out from the inn. His coachman, who was drunk, suddenly dozed off, and one could see from the distance, above the hood, between the two lanterns, the mass of his body that swayed from right to left with the giving of the traces. "Truly," said the druggist, "one ought to proceed most rigorously against drunkenness. I should like to see written up weekly at the door of the town hall on a board, ad hoc, the names of all those who during the week got intoxicated on alcohol. Besides, with regard to statistics, one would thus have, as it were, public records that one could refer to in case of need. But excuse me." And he once more ran off to the captain. The latter was going back to see his lathe again. "Perhaps you would not do ill," Homais said to him, "to send one of your men, or to go yourself." "Leave me alone," answered the tax collector. "It's all right." "Do not be uneasy," said the druggist, when he returned to his friends. "Monsieur Binet has assured me that all precautions have been taken. No sparks have fallen. The pumps are full. Let us go to rest." "Ma foi, I want it," said Madame Homais, yawning at large. "But never mind. We've had a beautiful day for our fête." Rodolphe repeated in a low voice, and with a tender look, "Oh, yes, very beautiful." And having bowed to one another, they separated. 2 days later, in the Finale de Rouen, there was a long article on the show. Homais had composed it with verve the very next morning. Why these festoons, these flowers, these garlands? Whither hurries this crowd like the waves of a furious sea under the torrents of a tropical sun pouring its heat upon our heads? Then he spoke of the condition of the peasants. Certainly the government was doing much, but not enough. "Courage," he cried to it. "1,000 reforms are indispensable. Let us accomplish them." Then, touching on the entry of the councillor, he did not forget "the martial air of our militia," nor "our most merry village maidens," nor the "bold-headed old men like patriarchs who were there, and of whom some, the remnants of our phalanxes, still felt their hearts beat at the manly sound of the drums." He cited himself among the first of the members of the jury, and he even called attention in a note to the fact that Monsieur Homais, chemist, had sent a memoir on cider to the Agricultural Society. When he came to the distribution of the prizes, he painted the joy of the prize winners in dithyrhambic strophes. The father embraced the son, the brother, the husband his consort. More than one showed his humble medal with pride, and no doubt when he got home to his good housewife he hung it up weeping on the modest walls of his cot. About 6 o'clock a banquet prepared in the meadow of Monsieur Léjard brought together the principal personages of the fête. The greatest cordiality reigned here. Divers toasts were proposed. Monsieur Lieuvain, the king; Monsieur Tuvache, the prefect; Monsieur de Roseraille, agriculture; Monsieur Homais, industry and the fine arts, those twin sisters; Monsieur Le Plichy, progress. In the evening some brilliant fireworks on a sudden illumined the air. One would have called it a veritable kaleidoscope, a real operatic scene, and for a moment our little locality might have thought itself transported into the midst of a dream of the 1,001 Nights. Let us state that no untoward event disturbed this family meeting. And he added, only the absence of the clergy was remarked. No doubt the priests understand progress in another fashion. Just as you please, messieurs the followers of Loyola. End of Part 2, Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Tafidis. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marx Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 9. 6 weeks passed. Rodolphe did not come again. At last, one evening, he appeared. The day after the show he had said to himself, "We mustn't go back too soon, that would be a mistake." And at the end of a week he had gone off hunting. After the hunting he had thought it was too late, and then he reasoned thus: "If, from the first day, she loved me, she must, from impatience to see me again, love me more. Let's go on with it." And he knew that his calculation had been right when, on entering the room, he saw Emma turn pale. She was alone. The day was drawing in. The small muslin curtain along the windows deepened the twilight. The gilding of the barometer, on which the rays of the sun fell, shone in the looking-glass between the meshes of the coral. Rodolphe remained standing, and Emma hardly answered his first conventional phrases. "I," he said, "have been busy. I have been ill." "Seriously?" she cried. "Well," said Rodolphe, sitting down at her side on a footstool, "no, it was because I didn't want to come back." "Why?" "Can you not guess?" He looked at her again, but so hard that she lowered her head, blushing. He went on. "Emma!" "Sir," she said, drawing back a little. "Ah, you see," replied he in a melancholy voice, "that I was right not to come back. For this name that fills my whole soul, and that escaped me, you forbid me to use. Madame Bovary, why all the world calls you thus. Besides, it is not your name, it is the name of another." He repeated, "Of another," and hid his face in his hands. "Yes, I think of you constantly. The memory of you drives me to despair. Oh, forgive me, I will leave you. Farewell, I will go far away, so far that you will never hear of me again. And yet, today, I know not what force impelled me towards you, for one does not struggle against heaven, one cannot resist the smile of angels, one is carried away by that which is beautiful, charming, adorable." It was the first time that Emma had heard such words spoken to herself, and her pride, like one who reposes bathed in warmth, expanded softly and fully at this glowing language. "But if I did not come," he continued, "if I could not see you, at least I have gazed long on all that surrounds you. At night, every night, I arose, I came hither, I watched your house, its glimmering in the moon, the trees in the garden swaying before your window, and the little lamp, a gleam shining through the window panes in the darkness. Ah, you never knew that there, so near you, so far from you, was a poor wretch." She turned towards him with a sob. "Oh, you are good," she said. "No, I love you, that is all. You do not doubt that. Tell me one word, only one word." And Rodolphe imperceptibly glided from the footstool to the ground. But a sound of wooden shoes was heard in the kitchen, and he noticed the door of the room was not closed. "How kind it would be of you," he went on, rising, "if you would humor a whim of mine. so as to go over her house. He wanted to know it, and Madame Bovary, seeing no objection to this, they both rose when Charles came in. "Good morning, doctor," Rodolphe said to him. The doctor, flattered at this unexpected title, launched out into obsequious phrases. Of this the other took advantage to pull himself together a little. "Madame was speaking to me," he then said, "about her health." Charles interrupted him. He had indeed 1,000 anxieties. His wife's palpitations of the heart were beginning again. Then Rodolphe asked if riding would not be good. "Certainly, excellent, just the thing. There's an idea. You are to follow it up." And as he objected that he had no horse, Monsieur Rodolphe offered one. He refused his offer, but did not insist. Then, to explain his visit, he said that his ploughman, the man of the bloodletting, still suffered from giddiness. "I'll call round," said Bovary. No, I'll send him to you. Will come. That will be more convenient for you." "Oh, very good, I thank you." And as soon as they were alone, "Why don't you accept Monsieur Boulanger's kind offer?" She assumed a sulky air, invented 1,000 excuses, and finally declared that perhaps it would look odd. "Well, what the deuce do I care for that?" said Charles, making a pirouette. "Health before everything. You're wrong. But how do you think I can ride when I haven't got a habit?" "You must order one," he answered. The riding habit decided her. When the habit was ready, Charles wrote to Monsieur Boulanger that his wife was at his command, and that they could contain his good nature. The next day at noon, Rodolphe appeared at Charles' door with 2 saddle horses. One had pink rosettes at his ears and a deerskin side saddle. Rodolphe had put on high soft boots, saying to himself that no doubt she had never seen anything like them. In fact, Emma was charmed with his appearance as he stood on the landing in his great velvet coat and white corduroy breeches. She was ready, she was waiting for him. Justin escaped from the chemist to see her start, and the chemist also came out. He was giving Monsieur Boulanger a little good advice. "An accident happens so easily. Be careful, your horses perhaps are mettlesome." She heard a noise above her. It was Félicité drumming the window panes to amuse little Berthe. The child blew her a kiss. Her mother answered with a wave of her whip. "A pleasant ride!" cried Monsieur Homais. "Prudence, above all, prudence!" And he flourished his newspaper as he saw them disappear. As soon as he fell to the ground, Emma's horse set off at a gallop. Rodolphe galloped by her side. Now and then they exchanged a word. Her figure slightly bent, her hand well up, and her right arm stretched out. She gave herself up to the cadence of the movement that rocked her in her saddle. At the bottom of the hill, Rodolphe gave his horse its head. They started together at a bound, and then suddenly the horses stopped, and her large blue veil fell about her. It was early in October. There was fog over the land. Hazy clouds hovered on the horizon between the outlines of the hills. Others, rent asunder, floated up and disappeared. Sometimes, through a rift in the clouds, beneath a ray of sunshine, gleamed from afar the roofs of Yonville, with the gardens at the water's edge, the yards, the walls, and the church steeple. Emma half closed her eyes to pick out her house, and never had this poor village where she lived appeared so small. From the height in which they were, the whole valley seemed an immense pale lake, sending off its vapor into the air. Clumps of trees here and there stood out like black rocks, and the tall lines of the poplars that rose above the mist were like a beach stirred by the wind. By the side, on the turf between the pines, a brown light shimmered in the warm atmosphere. The earth, ruddy like the powder of tobacco, deadened the noise of the steps, and with the edge of the shoes the horses, as they walked, kicked the fallen fir cones in front of them. Rodolphe and Emma thus went along the skirt of the wood. She turned away from time to time to avoid his look, and then she saw only the pine trunks in lines, whose monotonous succession made her a little giddy. The horses were panting, the leather of the saddles creaked. Just as they were entering the forest, the sun shone out. "God protects us," said Rodolphe. "Do you think so?" she said. "Forward, forward!" he continued. He chucked with his tongue. The 2 beasts set off at a trot. Long ferns by the roadside caught in Emma's stirrup. Rodolphe leaned forward and removed them as they rode along. At other times, to turn aside the branches, he passed close to her, and Emma felt his knee brushing against her leg. The sky was now blue. The leaves no longer stirred. There were spaces full of heather in flower, and plots of violets alternated with the confused patches of the trees that were grey, fawn, or golden coloured, according to the nature of the leaves. Often in the thicket was heard the fluttering of wings, or else the hoarse, soft cry of the ravens flying off amidst the oaks. They dismounted, Rodolphe facing up the horses. She walked on in front of the moss between the paths. But her long habit got in her way, although she held it up by the skirt, and Rodolphe, walking behind her, saw between the black cloth and the black shoe the fineness of a white stocking that seemed to him as if it were a part of her nakedness. She stopped. "I am tired," she said. "Come, try again," he went. "Courage." Then some 100 paces further on she again stopped, and through her veil, that fell sideways from her man's hat over her hips, her face appeared in a bluish transparency as if she were floating on the azure waves. "But where are we going?" He did not answer. She was breathing irregularly. Rodolphe looked round him, biting his moustache. They came to a larger space where the coppice had been cut. They sat down at the trunk of a fallen tree, and Rodolphe began speaking to her of his love. He did not begin by frightening her with compliments. He was calm, serious, melancholy. Emma listened to him with bowed head, and stirred bits of wood on the ground with the tip of her foot. But at the words, "Are not our destinies now one?" "Oh, no," she replied, "you know that well. It is impossible." She rose to go. He seized her by the wrist. She stopped. Then, having gazed at him for a few moments with an amorous and humid look, she said hurriedly, "I do not speak of it again. Where are the horses? Let us go back." He made a gesture of anger and annoyance. She repeated, "Where are the horses? Where are the horses?" Then, smiling a strange smile, his pupil fixed, his teeth set, he advanced with outstretched arms. She recoiled trembling. She stammered, "Oh, you frighten me, you hurt me, let me go." "If it must be," he went on, his face changing, and he again became respectful, caressing, timid. She gave him her arm. They went back. He said, "What was the matter with you? Why?" "I do not understand. You were mistaken, no doubt. In my soul you are as a Madonna on a pedestal, in a place lofty, secure, immaculate. But I need you to live. I must have your eyes, your voice, your thought. My friend, my sister, my angel." And he put out his arm around her waist. She feebly tried to disengage herself. He supported her thus as they walked along. But they heard the 2 horses browsing on the leaves. "Oh, one moment," said Rodolphe. "Do not let us go. Stay." He drew her further on to a small pool where duckweeds made a greenness on the water. Faded water lilies lay motionless between the reeds. At the noise of their steps in the grass, frogs jumped away to hide themselves. "I am wrong," she said. "I am mad to listen to you." "Why, Emma, Emma?" "Oh, Rodolphe," said the young woman slowly, leaning on his shoulder. The cloth of her habit caught against the velvet of his coat. She threw back her white neck, swelling with a sigh and faltering in tears, with a long shudder and hiding her face. She gave herself up to him. The shades of night were falling. The horizontal sun passing between the branches dazzled the eyes. Here and there around her the leaves on the ground trembled luminous patches, as if hummingbirds flying about had scattered their feathers. Silence was everywhere. Something sweet seemed to come forth from the trees. She felt a heart whose beating had begun again, and the blood coursing through her flesh like the stream of milk. Then far away, beyond the wood on the other hills, she heard a vague, prolonged cry, a voice which lingered, and in silence she heard it mingling like music with the last pulsations of her throbbing nerves. Rodolphe, with a cigar between his lips, was mending with his penknife one of the 2 broken bridles. They returned to Yonville by the same road. On the mud they saw again the traces of their horses side by side. The same thickets, the same stones to the grass. Nothing around him seemed changed, and yet, for her, something had happened more stupendous than if the mountains had moved in their places. Rodolphe now again bent forward and took her hand to kiss it. She was charming on horseback, upright, with a slender waist, her knee bent on the mane of her horse, her face somewhat flushed by the fresh air and the red of the evening. On entering Yonville, she met a horse prance in the road. People looked at her from the windows. At dinner her husband thought she looked well, but she pretended not to hear him when he inquired about her ride. She remained sitting there with her elbow at the side of a plate between the two lighted candles. "Emma," he said. "What?" "Well, I spent the afternoon at Monsieur Alexandre. He has an old cob, still very fine, only a little broken kneed, and that could be bought, I am sure, for 100 crowns," he added, "and thinking it might please you, I have bespoken it, bought it. Have I done right? Do tell me." She nodded her head in assent, and then a quarter of an hour later, "Are you going out tonight?" she asked. "Yes. Why?" "Oh, nothing, nothing, my dear." And as soon as she had got rid of Charles, she went and shut herself up in her room. At first she felt stunned. She saw the trees, the paths, the ditches, Rodolphe, and she again felt the pressure of his arm, while the leaves rustled and the reeds whistled. But when she saw herself in the glass, she wondered at her face. Never had her eyes been so large, so black, of so profound a depth. Something subtle about her being transfigured her. She repeated, "I have a lover, a lover," delighting at the idea that a second puberty had come to her. So at last she was to know those joys of love, that fever of happiness of which she had despaired. She was entering upon marvels where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium. An azure infinity encompassed her, the heights of sentiment sparkled on her thoughts, and ordinary existence appeared only afar off, down below in the shade, through the interspaces of these heights. Then she recalled the heroines of the books that she had read, and the lyric religion of these adulterous women began to sing in her memory with the voice of sisters that charmed her. She became herself, as it were, an actual part of these imaginings, and realized the love dream of youth that she saw herself in these type of amorous women whom she had so envied. Besides, Emma felt the satisfaction of revenge. Had she not suffered enough? But now she triumphed, and the love so long pent up burst forth in full joyous bubblings. She tasted it without remorse, without anxiety, without trouble. The day following passed with a new sweetness. They made vows to one another. She told him of her sorrows. Rodolphe interrupted her with kisses, and she, looking at him through half-closed eyes, asked him to call her again by her name, to say that he loved her. They were in the forest, as yesterday, in the shed of some wooden shoemaker. The walls were of straw, and the roof so low they had to stoop. They were seated side by side on a bed of dry leaves. From that day forth they wrote to one another regularly every evening. Emma placed her letter at the end of the garden, by the river, in a fissure of the wall. Rodolphe came to fetch it, and put another there, that she always found fault with as too short. One morning, when Charles had gone out before daybreak, she was seized with the fancy to see Rodolphe at once. She would go quickly to La Huchette, stay there an hour, and be back again at Yonville while everyone was still asleep. This idea made her pant with desire, and she soon found herself in the middle of the field, walking with rapid steps without looking behind her. Day was just breaking. Emma from afar recognized the lover's house. Two dove-tailed weathercocks stood out black against the pale dawn. Beyond the farmyard there was a detached building she thought must be the chateau. She entered it as if the doors at her approach had opened wide of their own accord. A large straight staircase led up to the corridor. Emma raised the latch of the door, and suddenly at the end of the room she saw a man sleeping. It was Rodolphe. She uttered a cry. "You here? You here?" he repeated. "How did you manage to come? Ah, your dress is damp." "I love you," she answered, throwing her arms about his neck. This first piece of daring successful. Now every time Charles went out, early Emma dressed quickly and slipped on tip down the steps that led to the waterside. But when the plank for the cows was taken up, she had to go by the walls alongside of the river. The bank was slippery. In order not to fall, she caught hold of a tuft of faded wallflowers. Then she went across plowed fields, in which she sank, stumbling and clogging her thin shoes. Her scarf, knotted round her head, fluttered to the wind in the meadows. She was afraid of the oxen. She began to run. She arrived out of breath, with rosy cheeks, and breathing out from the whole person a fresh perfume of sap of verdure or the open air. At this hour Rodolphe still slept. It was like a spring morning coming into his room. The yellow curtains along the windows let a heavy, whitish light enter softly. Emma felt about, opening and closing her eyes, while the drops of dew hanging from her hair formed, as it were, a topaz aureole round her face. Rodolphe, laughing, drew her to him, and pressed her to his breast. Then she examined the apartment, opened the drawers of the tables, combed her hair with its comb, and looked at herself in his shaving glass. Often she put between teeth a big pipe that lay on the table by the bed, amongst lemons and pieces of sugar near a bottle of water. It took them a good quarter of an hour to say good-bye. Then Emma cried. She would have wished never to leave Rodolphe. Something stronger than herself forced her to him. So much so that one day, seeing her come unexpectedly, he frowned, as one put out. "What is the matter with you?" she said. "Are you ill? Tell me." At last he declared, with a serious air, that her visits were becoming imprudent, that she was compromising herself. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Recording by Marietta Phyllis.
Part 2, Chapter 10 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 10. Gradually Rodolphe's fears took possession of her. At first love had intoxicated her, and she had thought of nothing beyond. But now that he was indispensable to her life, she feared to lose anything of this, or even that it should be disturbed. When she came back from his house she looked all about her, anxiously watching every form that passed in the horizon, and every village window from which she could be seen. She listened for steps, cries, the noise of the ploughs, and she stopped short, white and trembling more than the aspen leaves swaying overhead. One morning, as she was thus returning, she suddenly thought she saw the long barrel of a carbine that seemed to be aimed at her. It stuck out sideways from the end of a small tub, half buried in the grass on the edge of a ditch. Emma, half fainting with terror, nevertheless walked on, and a man stepped out of the tub like a jack-in-the-box. He had gaiters buckled up to the knees, his cap pulled down over his eyes, trembling lips, and a red nose. It was Captain Binet, lying in ambush for wild ducks. "You ought to have called out long ago," he exclaimed. "When one sees a gun, one should always give warning." The tax collector was thus trying to hide the fright he had had, for a prefectorial order having prohibited duck hunting except in boats, Monsieur Binet, despite his respect for the laws, was infringing them, and so he every moment expected to see the rural guard turn up. But this anxiety whetted his pleasure, and all alone in his tub he congratulated himself on his luck and on his cuteness. At sight of Emma he seemed relieved from a great weight, and at once entered upon a conversation. "It's warm, it's nipping." Emma answered nothing. He went on, "And you're out so early." "Yes," she said, stammering. "I am just come from the nurse where my child is." "Ah, very good, very good. For myself, I am here, just as you see me, since break of day, but the weather is so muggy that unless one had the bird at the mouth of the gun Good evening, Monsieur Binet," she interrupted him, turning on her heel. "Your servant, madame," he replied dryly, and he went back into his tub. Emma regretted having left the tax collector so abruptly. No doubt he would form unfavourable conjectures. The story about the nurse was the worst possible excuse, every one at Yonville knowing that the little Bovary had been at home with her parents for a year. Besides, no one was living in this direction. This path led only to La Huchette. Binet, then, would guess whence she came, and he would not keep silence. He would talk, that was certain. She remained until evening, racking her brain with every conceivable lying project, and had constantly before her eyes that imbecile with the game bag. Charles, after dinner, seeing her gloomy, proposed, by way of distraction, to take her to the chemist's, and the first person she caught sight of in the shop was the tax collector again. He was standing in front of the counter, lit up by the gleams of the red bottle, and was saying, "Please give me half an ounce of vitriol." "Just in," cried the druggist. "Bring us the sulphuric acid." Then to Emma, who was going up to Madame Homais' room, "No, stay here. It isn't worth while going up. She is just coming down. Warm yourself at the stove in the meantime. Excuse me. Good day, doctor." For the chemist much enjoyed pronouncing the word doctor, as if addressing another by it reflected on himself some of the grandeur that he found in it. "Now take care not to upset the mortars. You'd better fetch some chairs from the little room. You know very well that the armchairs are not to be taken out of the drawing room." And to put his armchair back in its place he was darting away from the counter, when Binet asked him for half an ounce of sugar acid. "Sugar acid!" said the chemist contemptuously. "Don't know it. I'm ignorant of it. But perhaps you want oxalic acid. It is oxalic acid, isn't it?" Binet explained that he wanted a corrosive to make himself some copper water with which to remove rust from his hunting things. Emma shuddered. The chemist began saying, "Indeed, the weather is not propitious on account of the damp." "Nevertheless," replied the tax collector with a sly look, "there are people who like it." She was stifling. "And give me will he never go?" thought she. "And give me half an ounce of resin and turpentine, 4 ounces of yellow wax, and 3 half ounces of animal charcoal, if you please, to clean the varnished leather of my togs." The druggist was beginning to cut the wax when Madame Homais appeared, Irma in her arms, Napoleon by her side, and Athalie following. She sat down on the velvet seat by the window, and the lad squatted down on a footstool, while his eldest sister hovered round the jujube box near her papa. The latter was filling funnels and corking phials, sticking on labels, making up parcels. Around him all were silent, only from time to time were heard the weights jingling in the balance, and a few low words from the chemist giving directions to his pupil. "And how's the little woman?" suddenly asked Madame Homais. "Silence!" exclaimed her husband, who was writing down some figures in his waste book. "Why didn't you bring her?" she went on in a low voice. "Hush, hush!" said Emma, pointing with her finger to the druggist. But Binet, quite absorbed in looking over his bill, had probably heard nothing. At last he went out. Then Emma, relieved, uttered a deep sigh. "How hard you are breathing!" said Madame Homais. "Well, you see, it's rather warm," she replied. So the next day they talked over how to arrange their rendezvous. Emma wanted to bribe her servant with a present, but it would be better to find some safe house at Yonville. Rodolphe promised to look for one. All through the winter, 3 or 4 times a week, in the dead of night, he came to the garden. Emma had on purpose taken away the key of the gate, which Charles thought lost. To call her, Rodolphe threw a sprinkle of sand at the shutters. She jumped up with a start, but sometimes he had to wait, for Charles had a mania for chatting by the fireside, and he would not stop. She was wild with impatience. If her eyes could have done it, she would have hurled him out at the window. At last she would begin to undress, then take up a book, and go on reading very quietly, as if the book amused her. But Charles, who was in bed, called to her to come too. "Come now, Emma," he said, "it is time." "Yes, I'm coming," she answered. Then, as the candles dazzled him, he turned to the wall and fell asleep. She escaped, smiling, palpitating, undressed. Rodolphe had a large cloak. He wrapped her in it, and putting his arm round her waist, he drew her without a word to the end of the garden. It was in the arbour, on the same seat of old sticks where formerly Léon had looked at her so amorously on the summer evenings. She never thought of him now. The stars shone through the leafless jasmine branches. Behind them they heard the river flowing, and now again on the bank the rustling of the dry reeds. Masses of shadow here and there loomed out in the darkness, and sometimes, vibrating with one movement, they rose up and swayed like immense black waves, pressing forward to engulf them. The cold of the nights made them clasp closer. The sighs of their lips seemed to them deeper, their eyes, that they could hardly see, larger, and in the midst of the silence low words were spoken that fell on their souls sonorous, crystalline, and that reverberated in multiplied vibrations. When the night was rainy, they took refuge in the consulting room between the cart shed and the stable. She lighted one of the kitchen candles that she had hidden behind the books. Rodolphe settled down there as if at home. The sight of the library, of the bureau, of the whole apartment, in fine, excited his merriment, and he could not refrain from making jokes about Charles, which rather embarrassed Emma. She would have liked to see him more serious, and even on occasions more dramatic, as, for example, when she thought she heard a noise of approaching steps in the alley. "Some one is coming," she said. He blew out the light. "Have you your pistols?" "Why?" "Why, to defend yourself," replied Emma. "From your husband? Oh, poor devil!" And Rodolphe finished his sentence with a gesture that said, "I could crush him with a flip of my finger." She was wonder stricken at his bravery, although she felt in it a sort of indecency and a naive coarseness that scandalized her. Rodolphe reflected a good deal on the affair of the pistols. If she had spoken seriously, it was very ridiculous, he thought, even odious, for he had no reason to hate the good Charles, not being what is called devoured by jealousy; and on this subject Emma had taken a great vow that he did not think in the best of taste. Besides, she was growing very sentimental. She had insisted on exchanging miniatures. They had cut off handfuls of hair, and now she was asking for a ring, a real wedding ring, in sign of an eternal union. She often spoke to him of the evening chimes, of the voices of nature. Then she talked to him of her mother, hers, and of his mother, his. Rodolphe had lost his 20 years ago. Emma none the less consoled him with caressing words, as one would have done a lost child, and she sometimes even said to him, gazing at the moon, "I'm sure that above there together they approve of our love." But she was so pretty! He had possessed so few women of such ingenuousness. This love without debauchery was a new experience for him, and drawing him out of his lazy habits, caressed at once his pride and his sensuality. Emma's enthusiasm, which his bourgeois good sense disdained, seemed to him in his heart of hearts charming, since it was lavished on him. Then, sure of being loved, he no longer kept up appearances, and insensibly his ways changed. He had no longer, as formerly, words so gentle that they made her cry, nor passionate caresses that made her mad, so that their great love, which engrossed her life, seemed to lessen beneath her, like the water of a stream absorbed into its channel, and she could see the bed of it. She would not believe it, she redoubled in tenderness, and Rodolphe concealed his indifference less and less. She did not know if she regretted having yielded to him, or whether she did not wish, on the contrary, to enjoy him the more. The humiliation of feeling herself weak was turning to rancour, tempered by their voluptuous pleasures. It was not affection, it was like a continual seduction. He subjugated her; she almost feared him. Appearances, nevertheless, were calmer than ever. Rodolphe having succeeded in carrying out the adultery after his own fancy. And at the end of 6 months, when the springtime came, they were to one another like a married couple, tranquilly keeping up a domestic flame. It was the time of year when old Rouault sent his turkey in remembrance of the setting of his leg. The present always arrived with a letter. Emma cut the string that tied it to the basket, and read the following lines: "My dear children, I hope this will find you well, and that this one will be as good as the others; for it seems to me a little more tender, if I may venture to say so, and heavier. But next time, for a change, I'll give you a turkey cock, unless you have a preference for some dabs, and send me back the hamper, if you please, with the 2 old ones. I have had an accident with my cart sheds, whose covering flew off one windy night among the trees. The harvest has not been over good either. Finally, I don't know when I shall come to see you. It is so difficult now to leave the house since I am alone, my poor Emma." Here there was a break in the lines, as if the old fellow had dropped his pen to dream a little while. "For myself, I am very well, except for a cold I caught the other day at the fair at Yvetot, where I had gone to hire a shepherd, having turned away mine because he was too dainty. How we are to be pitied with such a lot of thieves! Besides, he was also rude. I heard from a pedlar, who, travelling through your part of the country this winter, had a tooth drawn, that Bovary was as usual working hard. That doesn't surprise me, and he showed me his tooth. We had some coffee together. I asked him if he had seen you, and he said not, but that he had seen 2 horses in the stables, from which I conclude that business is looking up. So much the better, my dear children, and may God send you every imaginable happiness. It grieves me not yet to have seen my dear little granddaughter, Berthe Bovary. I have planted an Orleans plum tree for her in the garden under your room, and I won't have it touched unless it is to have jam made for her by and by, that I will keep in the cupboard for her when she comes. Good bye, my dear children. I kiss you, my girl, you too, my son-in-law, and the little one on both cheeks. I am, with best compliments, your loving father, Théodore Rouault." She held the coarse paper in her fingers for some minutes. The spelling mistakes were interwoven one with the other, and Emma followed the kindly thought that cackled right through it like a hen half hidden in the hedge of thorns. The writing had been dried with ashes from the hearth, for a little grey powder slipped from the letter on to her dress, and she almost thought she saw her father bending over the hearth to take up the tongs. How long since she had been with him, sitting on the footstool in the chimney corner, where she used to burn the end of a bit of wood in the great flame of the sea sedges. She remembered the summer evenings all full of sunshine. The colts neighed when anyone passed by, and galloped, galloped. Under her window there was a beehive, and sometimes the bees, wheeling round in the light, struck against her window like rebounding balls of gold. What happiness there had been at that time! What freedom! What hope! What an abundance of illusions! Nothing was left of them now. She had got rid of them all in her soul's life, in all her successive conditions of life, maidenhood, her marriage, and her love, thus constantly losing them all her life through, like a traveller who leaves something of his wealth at every inn along his road. But what then made her so unhappy? What was the extraordinary catastrophe that had transformed her? And she raised her head, looking round as if to seek the cause of that which made her suffer. An April ray was dancing on the china of the whatnot. The fire burnt. Beneath her slippers she felt the softness of the carpet. The day was bright, the air warm, and she heard her child shouting with laughter. In fact, the little girl was just then rolling on the lawn in the midst of the grass that was being turned. She was lying flat on her stomach at the top of a rick. The servant was holding her by her skirt. Lestiboudois was raking by her side, and every time he came near she leant forward, beating the air with both her arms. "Bring her to me," said her mother, rushing to embrace her. "How I love you, my poor child! How I love you!" Then, noticing that the tips of her ears were rather dirty, she rang at once for warm water and washed her, changed her linen, her stockings, her shoes, asked 1,000 questions about her health, as if on the return from a long journey, and finally, kissing her again and crying a little, she gave her back to the servant, who stood quite thunderstricken at this excess of tenderness. That evening Rodolphe found her more serious than usual. "That will pass over," he concluded. "It's a whim." And he missed 3 rendezvous running. When he did come, she showed herself cold and almost contemptuous. "Ah, you're losing your time, my lady." And he pretended not to notice her melancholy sighs, nor the handkerchief she took out. Then Emma repented. She even asked herself why she detested Charles, if it had not been better to have been able to love him. But he gave her no opportunities for such a revival of sentiment, so that she was much embarrassed by her desire for sacrifice, when the druggist came just in time to provide her with an opportunity. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 11. He had recently read a eulogy on a new method for curing club foot, and as he was a partisan of progress, he conceived the patriotic idea that Yonville, in order to keep to the fore, ought to have some operations for strephopody or club foot. "For," said he to Emma, "what risk is there? See!" And he enumerated on his fingers the advantage of the attempt. Success, almost certain relief and beautifying of the patient, celebrity acquired by the operator. Why, for example, should not your husband relieve poor Hippolyte of the Lion d'Or? Note that he would not fail to tell about his cure to all the travellers, and then— Homais lowered his voice and looked round him. "Who is to prevent me from sending a short paragraph on the subject to the paper? Eh? Goodness me! An article gets about, it is talked of, it ends by making a snowball, and who knows? Who knows?" In fact, Bovary might succeed. Nothing proved to Emma that he was not clever, and what a satisfaction for her to have urged him to a step by which his reputation and fortune would be increased. She only wished to lean on something more solid than love. Charles, urged by the druggist and by her, allowed himself to be persuaded. He sent to Rouault for Dr. Duval's volume, and every evening, holding his head between both hands, plunged into the reading of it. While he was studying equinus, varus, and valgus, that is to say, catastrephopody, endostrephopody, and exostrephopody, or better, the various turnings of the foot downwards, inwards, and outwards, with the hypostrephopody and anastrephopody, otherwise torsion downwards and upwards, Monsieur Homais, with all sorts of arguments, was exhorting the lad at the inn to submit to the operation. "You will scarcely feel probably a slight pain. It is a simple prick, like a little bloodletting, less than the extraction of certain corns." Hippolyte, reflecting, rolled his stupid eyes. "However," continued the chemist, "it doesn't concern me. It's for your sake, for pure humanity. I should like to see you, my friend, rid of your hideous caudication, together with that waddling of the lumbar regions, which, whatever you say, must considerably interfere with you in the exercise of your calling." Then Homais represented to him how much jollier and brisker he would feel afterwards, and even gave him to understand that he would be more likely to please the women. And the stable boy began to smile heavily. Then he attacked him through his vanity. "Aren't you a man? Hang it! What would you have done if you had had to go into the army, to go and fight beneath the standard? Ah, Hippolyte!" and Homais retired, declaring that he could not understand this obstinacy, this blindness in refusing the benefactions of science. The poor fellow gave way, for it was like a conspiracy. Binet, who never interfered with other people's business, Madame Lefrancois, Artémise, the neighbours, even the mayor, Monsieur Tuvache, every one persuaded him, lectured him, shamed him. But what finally decided him was that it would cost him nothing. Bovary even undertook to provide the machine for the operation. This generosity was an idea of Emma's, and Charles consented to it, thinking in his heart of hearts that his wife was an angel. So, by the advice of the chemist, and after 3 fresh starts, he had a kind of box made by the carpenter, with the aid of the locksmith, that weighed about 8 pounds, and in which iron, wood, shear iron, leather, screws, and nuts had not been spared. But to know which of Hippolyte's tendons to cut, it was necessary first of all to find out what kind of club foot he had. He had a foot forming almost a straight line with the leg, which, however, did not prevent it from being turned in, so that it was an equinus, together with something of a varus, or else a slight varus with a strong tendency to equinus. But with this equinus, wide in foot like a horse's hoof, with Rouault's skin, dry tendons, and large toes, on which the black nails looked as if made of iron, the club foot ran about like a deer from morn till night. He was constantly to be seen on the Place, jumping round the carts, thrusting his limping foot forwards. He seemed even stronger on that leg than on the other. By dint of hard service, it had acquired, as it were, moral qualities of patience and energy, and when he was given some heavy work, he stood on it in preference to its fellow. Now, as it was equinus, it was necessary to cut the tendon of Achilles, and, if need were, the anterior tibial muscle could be seen to afterwards for getting rid of the varus, for the doctor did not dare to risk both operations at once. He was even trembling already for fear of injuring some important region that he did not know. Neither Ambroise Paré, applying for the first time since Celsus, after an interval of 15 centuries, a ligature to an artery, nor Dupuytren, about to open an abscess in the brain, nor Gensoul, when he first took away the superior maxilla, had hearts that trembled, hands that shook, minds so strained as Monsieur Bovary when he approached Hippolyte, his tenotome between his fingers. And as at hospitals, near by on a table lay a heap of lint, with waxed thread, many bandages, a pyramid of bandages, every bandage to be found at the druggist's. It was Monsieur Homais, who since morning had been organising all these preparations, as much to dazzle the multitude as to keep up his illusions. Charles pierced the skin, a dry crackling was heard, the tendon was cut, the operation over. Hippolyte could not get over his surprise, but bent over Bovary's hands to cover them with kisses. "Come, be calm," said the druggist. "Later on you will show your gratitude to your benefactor." And he went down to tell the result to 5 or 6 inquirers, who were waiting in the yard, and who fancied that Hippolyte would reappear walking properly. Then Charles, having buckled his patient into the machine, went home, where Emma, all anxiety, awaited him at the door. She threw herself on his neck. They sat down to table, he ate much, and at dessert he even wanted to take a cup of coffee, a luxury he only permitted himself on Sundays, when there was company. The evening was charming, full of prattle, of dreams together. They talked about their future fortune, of the improvements to be made in their house. He saw people's estimation of him growing, his comforts increasing, his wife always loving him, and she was happy to refresh herself with a new sentiment, healthier, better, to feel at last some tenderness for this poor fellow who adored her. The thought of Rodolphe for one moment passed through her mind, but her eyes turned again to Charles. She even noticed with surprise that he had not bad teeth. They were in bed when Monsieur Homais, in spite of the servant, suddenly entered the room, holding in his hand a sheet of paper just written. It was the paragraph he intended for the Fanal de Rouen. He brought it for them to read. "Read it yourself," said Bovary. He read: "Despite the prejudices that still invest a part of the face of Europe like a net, the light nevertheless begins to penetrate our country places. Thus, on Tuesday, our little town of Yonville found itself the scene of a surgical operation which is at the same time an act of loftiest philanthropy. Monsieur Bovary, one of our most distinguished practitioners—" "Oh, that is too much, too much!" said Charles, choking with emotion. "No, no, not at all. What next?" "Performed an operation on a club-footed man. I have not used the scientific term, because you know in a newspaper every one would not perhaps understand. The masses must—" "No doubt," said Bovary. "Go on." "I proceed," said the chemist. "Monsieur Bovary, one of our most distinguished practitioners, performed an operation on a club-footed man called Hippolyte Tautain, stableman for the last 25 years at the hotel of the Lion d'Or, kept by widow Lefrancois, at the Place d'Armes. The novelty of the attempt and the interest incident to the subject had attracted such a concourse of persons that there was a veritable obstruction on the threshold of the establishment. The operation, moreover, was performed as if by magic, and barely a few drops of blood appeared on the skin, as though to say that the rebellious tendon had at last given way beneath the efforts of art. The patient, strangely enough, we affirm it as an eye witness, complained of no pain. His condition up to the present time leaves nothing to be desired. Everything tends to show that his convalescence will be brief, and who knows even if at our next village festivity we shall not see our good Hippolyte figuring in the Bacchic dance in the midst of a chorus of joyous boon companions, and thus proving to all eyes by his verve and his capers his complete cure. Honour, then, to the generous savants! Honour to those indefatigable spirits who consecrate their vigils to the amelioration or to the alleviation of their kind! Honour, thrice honour! Is it not time to cry that the blind shall see, the deaf hear, the lame walk? But that which fanaticism formerly promised to its elect, science now accomplishes for all men. We shall keep our readers informed as to the successive phases of this remarkable cure." This did not prevent Mere Lefrancois from coming 5 days after, scared, and crying out, "Help! he is dying! I am going crazy!" Charles rushed to the Lion d'Or, and the chemist, who caught sight of him passing along the Place, hatless, abandoned his shop. He appeared himself, breathless, red, anxious, and asking every one who was going up the stairs, "Why, what's the matter with our interesting strephopode?" The strephopode was writhing in hideous convulsions, so that the machine in which his leg was enclosed was knocked against the wall enough to break it. With many precautions, in order not to disturb the position of the limb, the box was removed, and an awful sight presented itself. The outlines of the foot disappeared in such a swelling that the entire skin seemed about to burst, and it was covered with ecchymosis caused by the famous machine. Hippolyte had already complained of suffering from it. No attention had been paid to him. They had to acknowledge that he had not been altogether wrong, and he was freed for a few hours. But hardly had the oedema gone down to some extent than the two savants thought fit to put back the limb in the apparatus, strapping it tighter to hasten matters. At last, 3 days after, Hippolyte being unable to endure it any longer, they once more removed the machine, and were much surprised at the result they saw. The livid tumefaction spread over the leg, with blisters here and there, whence there oozed a black liquid. Matters were taking a serious turn. Hippolyte began to worry himself, and Mere Lefrancois had him installed in the little room near the kitchen, so that he might at least have some distraction. But the tax collector, who dined there every day, complained bitterly of such companionship. Then Hippolyte was removed to the billiard room. He lay there moaning under his heavy coverings, pale, with long beard, sunken eyes, and from time to time turning his perspiring head on the dirty pillow, where the flies alighted. Madame Bovary went to see him. She brought him linen for his poultices. She comforted and encouraged him. Besides, he did not want for company, especially on market days, when the peasants were knocking about the billiard balls round him, fenced with the cues, smoked, drank, sang, and brawled. "How are you?" they said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Ah, you're not up to much, it seems, but it's your own fault. You should do this, do that." And then they told him stories of people who had all been cured by other remedies than his. Then, by the way of consolation, they added, "You give way too much. Get up. You coddle yourself like a king. All the same, old chap, you don't smell nice." Gangrene, in fact, was spreading more and more. Bovary himself turned sick at it. He came every hour, every moment. Hippolyte looked at him with eyes full of terror, sobbing, "When shall I get well? Oh, save me! How unfortunate I am! How unfortunate I am!" And the doctor left, always recommending him to diet himself. "Don't listen to him, my lad," said Mere Lefrancois. "Haven't they tortured you enough already? You'll grow still weaker. Here, swallow this." And she gave him some good beef tea, a slice of mutton, a piece of bacon, and sometimes small glasses of brandy that he had not the strength to put to his lips. Abbe Bournisien, hearing that he was growing worse, asked to see him. He began by pitying his sufferings, declaring at the same time that he ought to rejoice at them, since it was the will of the Lord, and take advantage of the occasion to reconcile himself to heaven. "For," said the ecclesiastic in a paternal tone, "you rather neglected your duties. You are rarely seen at divine worship. How many years is it since you approached the holy table? I understand that your work, that the whirl of the world, may have kept you from care for your salvation, but now is the time to reflect. Yet don't despair. I have known great sinners who, about to appear before God, you are not yet at this point, I know, had implored his mercy, and who certainly died in the best frame of mind. Let us hope that, like them, you will set us a good example. Thus, as a precaution, what is to prevent you from saying morning and evening a Hail Mary full of grace, and Our Father which art in heaven? Yes, do that for my sake, to oblige me. That won't cost you anything. Will you promise me?" The poor devil promised. The cure came back day after day. He chatted with the landlady, and even told anecdotes interspersed with jokes and puns that Hippolyte did not understand. Then, as soon as he could, he fell back upon matters of religion, putting on an appropriate expression of face. His zeal seemed successful, for the club-foot soon manifested a desire to go on a pilgrimage to Bon Secours if he were cured, to which Monsieur Bournisien replied that he saw no objection. Two precautions were better than one. It was no risk, anyhow. The druggist was indignant at what he called the manoeuvres of the priest. They were prejudicial, he said, to Hippolyte's convalescence, and he kept repeating to Madame Lefrancois, "Leave him alone, leave him alone. You perturb his morals with your mysticism." But the good woman would no longer listen to him. He was the cause of it all. From a spirit of contradiction, she hung up near the bedside of the patient a basin filled with holy water and a branch of box. Religion, however, seemed no more able to succour him than surgery, and the invincible gangrene still spread from the extremities towards the stomach. It was all very well to vary the potions and change the poultices. The muscles each day rotted more and more, and at last Charles replied by an affirmative nod of the head when Mere Lefrancois asked him if she could not, as a forlorn hope, send for Monsieur Canivet of Neufchâtel, who was a celebrity. A doctor of medicine, 50 years of age, enjoying a good position and self-possessed, Charles's colleague did not refrain from laughing disdainfully when he had uncovered the leg, mortified to the knee. Then, having flatly declared that it must be amputated, he went off to the chemist's to rail at the asses who could have reduced a poor man to such a state. Shaking Monsieur Homais by the button of his coat, he shouted out in the shop, "These are the inventions of Paris! These are the ideas of those gentry of the capital! It is like strabismus, chloroform, lithotrity, a heap of monstrosities that the government ought to prohibit. But they want to do the clever, and they cram you with remedies without troubling about the consequences. We are not so clever, not we. We are not savants, coxcombs, fops. We are practitioners. We cure people, and we should not dream of operating on any one who is in perfect health. Straighten club feet? As if one could straighten club feet! It is as if one wished, for example, to make a hunchback straight. Homais suffered as he listened to this discourse, and he concealed his discomfort beneath a courtier's smile, for he needed to humour Monsieur Canivet, whose prescriptions sometimes came as far as Yonville. So he did not take up the defence of Bovary, he did not even make a single remark, and, renouncing his principles, he sacrificed his dignity to the more serious interests of his business. This amputation of the thigh by Dr. Canivet was a great event in the village. On that day all the inhabitants got up earlier, and the Grande Rue, although full of people, had something lugubrious about it, as if an execution had been expected. At the grocer's they discussed Hippolyte's illness. The shops did no business, and Madame Tuvache, the mayor's wife, did not stir from her window, such was her impatience to see the operator arrive. He came in his gig, which he drove himself, but the springs of the right side having at length given way beneath the weight of his corpulence, it happened that the carriage, as it rolled along, leant over a little, and on the other cushion near him could be seen a large box, covered in red sheep leather, whose 3 brass clasps shone grandly. After he had entered, like a whirlwind, the porch of the Lion d'Or, the doctor, shouting very loud, ordered them to unharness his horse. Then he went into the stable to see that he was eating his oats all right, for on arriving at a patient's he first of all looked after his mare and his gig. People even said about this, "Ah, Monsieur Canivet's a character!" And he was the more esteemed for this imperturbable coolness. The universe to the last man might have died, and he would not have missed the smallest of his habits. Homais presented himself. "I count on you," said the doctor. "Are we ready? Come along." But the druggist, turning red, confessed that he was too sensitive to assist at such an operation. "When one is a simple spectator," he said, "the imagination, you know, is impressed. And then I have such a nervous system." "Pshaw!" interrupted Canivet. "On the contrary, you seem to me inclined to apoplexy. Besides, that doesn't astonish me, for you chemist fellows are always poking about your kitchens, which must end by spoiling your constitutions. Now, just look at me. I get up every day at 4 o'clock, I shave with cold water, and am never cold. I don't wear flannels, and I never catch cold. My carcass is good enough. I live now in one way, now in another, like a philosopher taking pot luck. That is why I'm not squeamish like you, and it is as indifferent to me to carve a Christian as the first fowl that turns up. Then perhaps you'll say, 'Habit, habit.'" Then, without any consideration for Hippolyte, who was sweating with agony between his sheets, these gentlemen entered into a conversation, in which the druggist compared the coolness of a surgeon to that of a general, and this comparison was pleasing to Canivet, who launched out on the exigencies of his art. He looked upon it as a sacred office, although the ordinary practitioners dishonoured it. At last, coming back to the patient, he examined the bandages brought by Homais, the same that had appeared for the club foot, and asked for some one to hold the limb for him. Lestiboudois was sent for, and Monsieur Canivet, having turned up his sleeves, passed into the billiard room, while the druggist stayed with Artémise and the landlady, both whiter than their aprons, and with ears strained towards the door. Bovary, during this time, did not dare to stir from his house. He kept downstairs in the sitting room by the side of the fireless chimney, his chin on his breast, his hands clasped, his eyes staring. "What a mishap!" he thought. "What a mishap!" Perhaps, after all, he had made some slip. He thought it over, but could hit upon nothing. But the most famous surgeons also made mistakes, and that is what no one would ever believe. People, on the contrary, would laugh, jeer. It would spread as far as Forges, as Neufchâtel, as Rouen, everywhere. Who could say if his colleagues would not write against him? Polemics would ensue. He would have to answer in the papers. Hippolyte might even prosecute him. He saw himself dishonoured, ruined, lost, and his imagination, assailed by a world of hypotheses, tossed amongst them like an empty cask borne by the sea and floating upon the waves. Emma, opposite, watched him. She did not share his humiliation. She felt another, that of having supposed such a man was worth anything. As if 20 times already she had not sufficiently perceived his mediocrity. Charles was walking up and down the room. His boots creaked on the floor. "Sit down," she said. "You fidget me." He sat down again. How was it that she who was so intelligent, could have allowed herself to be deceived again? And through what deplorable madness had she thus ruined her life, by continual sacrifices? She recalled all her instincts of luxury, all the privations of her soul, the sordidness of marriage, of the household, her dreams sinking into the mire like wounded swallows, all that she had longed for, all that she had denied herself, all that she might have had. And for what? For what? In the midst of the silence that hung over the village, a heart-rending cry rose on the air. Bovary turned white to fainting. She knit her brows with a nervous gesture, then went on. And it was for him, for this creature, for this man, who understood nothing, who felt nothing. For he was there, quite quiet, not even suspecting that the ridicule of his name would henceforth sully hers as well as his. She had made efforts to love him, and she had repented with tears for having yielded to another. But it was perhaps a valgus, suddenly exclaimed Bovary, who was meditating. At the unexpected shock of this phrase, falling on her thought like a leaden bullet on a silver plate, Emma, shuddering, raised her head in order to find out what he meant to say, and they looked at the other in silence, almost amazed to see each other, so far sundered were they by their inner thoughts. Charles gazed at her with the dull look of a drunken man, while he listened motionless to the last cries of the sufferer, that followed each other in long drawn modulations, broken by sharp spasms, like the far off howling of some beast being slaughtered. Emma bit her wan lips, and rolling between her fingers a piece of coral that she had broken, fixed on Charles the burning glance of her eyes like two arrows of fire about to dart forth. Everything in him irritated her now: his face, his dress, what he did not say, his whole person, his existence in fine. She repented of her past virtue as of a crime, and what still remained of it rumbled away beneath the furious blows of her pride. She revelled in all the evil ironies of triumphant adultery. The memory of her lover came back to her with dazzling attractions. She threw her whole soul into it, borne away towards this image with a fresh enthusiasm. And Charles seemed to her as much removed from her life, as absent for ever, as impossible and annihilated as if he had been about to die and were passing under her eyes. There was a sound of steps on the pavement. Charles looked up, and through the lowered blinds he saw at the corner of the market, in the broad sunshine, Dr. Canivet, who was wiping his brow with his handkerchief. Homais, behind him, was carrying a large red box in his hand, and both were going towards the chemist's. Then, with a feeling of sudden tenderness and discouragement, Charles turned to his wife, saying to her, "Oh, kiss me, my own!" "Leave me!" she said, red with anger. "What is the matter?" he asked, stupefied. "Be calm, compose yourself. You know well enough that I love you. Come." "Enough!" she cried, with a terrible look. and escaping from the room, Emma closed the door so violently that the barometer fell from the wall and smashed on the floor. Charles sank back into his armchair, overwhelmed, trying to discover what could be wrong with her, fancying some nervous illness, weeping, and vaguely feeling something fatal and incomprehensible whirling round him. When Rodolphe came to the garden that evening, he found his mistress waiting for him at the foot of the steps on the lowest stair. They threw their arms round one another, and all their rancour melted like snow beneath the warmth of that kiss. Chapter 12